experts from around the world to talk about their own experiences and advice and ideas about how we can better work with First Nations communities to solve the climate crisis. So we're going to kick off with some introductory remarks from Australia's inaugural Ambassador for First Nations Peoples, Justin Mohammed. Then we'll invite our panellists up to the stage and have a moderated question and answer session at which I'm promising to provide plenty of opportunity for audience questions, so please have them ready if you feel so inclined. So to kick things off, Justin Mohammed, please come up to the stage.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd first of all like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands which we're meeting on, pay my respects to their elders past and present. Sometimes we can just briefly go over that, but every time we wake up in the morning and work and live, I think it's very important to acknowledge the people that have been here before us and have cared for the land before we've got here. As mentioned, I'm the inaugural Ambassador for First Nations People of Australia. I'm a proud Garangarang man from Bundaberg in Queensland. So if anyone knows Australia, Queensland's the best state in Australia. Brisbane, it's about 3 hours north of Brisbane by car, 3.5, depends how fast you drive. But that's where I'm situated. Before I get into the speech, I'm going to do this now, but some people have asked what I'm wearing around my neck. And when I was announced as the ambassador, I had a previous job in the state of Victoria in justice, and we used to do, every quarter, we used to call these community gatherings around how we get better justice outcomes for our First Nations people in Australia. So all the community would come through and would have these yarning circles, we call it in Australia. And it was my very last one, and Elder from one of the communities came up. She's one of the aunties, and she came up to me and she said, "My son, I want to give you this. This is her totem. These are emu feathers." And she goes, "I want to put it on you, and I want you to be like an emu. I want you to be strong like an emu." And she went through an explanation about the emu and its strengths and its protection as it protects and looks over its young. But importantly, for a bit of fun fact, but a true fact, an emu is our biggest bird in Australia, but it doesn't take a backward step. It doesn't know how to, it just keeps going forward. And so I wear this today, giving me strength on this special day as the Indigenous Day, and hopefully many other people here in this room. We know that our identity and relationships, our action and focus provide important and ancient guidance, principles for our people, not only just in Australia, but also globally. And we have to ensure that we get these, elevate the pathways for our Indigenous peoples, our First Nations peoples, to have a greater say in climate. And we're going to hear this today by a number of really keynote speakers on this. As Indigenous peoples, we're already, and I've speaking with people, both in Australia but also globally, I know that we're already seeing it, and many of our people are living with the impacts of climate change. I've heard this firsthand from my own family, the First Nation communities in Australia, and as mentioned globally, and it's the impacts of the changing climate that is right there for us. It doesn't just impact our environment in the sense what we see, but it impacts our livelihoods and our ongoing connection to land, sea and country. We know we aren't alone in this. We've heard this time and time again over this last week. Many Indigenous peoples from many different nations have talked about things that are similar, but also diversity and how the effects of climate is taking its place. We know that it's the single greatest threat on our livelihoods, our security and our well-being in the Pacific and globally. The Pacific region, I know there's many brothers and sisters here from the Pacific. We believe, we are a family. We probably haven't bonded together enough to combat this, but this is our commitment from our government and across Pacific nations and their governments to have a really strong focus of how our Indigenous knowledges can be placed into this very important challenge that we have. Indigenous perspectives are critical in climate advocacy endeavours, and our deep experience of climate change is grown through our connection to country and sea, and we've had this since the beginning of time. We need to listen to Indigenous voices to properly understand the impacts of climate change and finding those solutions. I don't know if he's still in the room. We just had a brief meeting, the three of us, with our former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, who was talking about... He's still here? Oh, there he is. I better get this right. But we talked about these ancient knowledges that we've had for tens of thousands of years, where the world hasn't really looked at it and looked at the ways that can assist and be part of this modern world that we live in now. But in that conversation, it's time that we start learning and leaning on those ancient knowledges that we have to bring them into this contemporary world that we are, to address this very important challenge that we have globally. We've recently seen in our Australian government a bold step forward of pledging a new law to reach the net zero emissions by 2050. But in this profound journey of change, and it is a real change, we will not be able to achieve this if we do not listen to engage with our First Nations communities. That is the bottom line. And I think that's becoming louder and clearer as each day, each month goes by. And after these panel speakers speak, you'll hear why we will not be able to achieve those without our Indigenous knowledges. We've endured some very harsh realities right across the globe, and I'm sure we can all speak of experiences and people that we know close to us as families, not only Indigenous, also our and non-Indigenous brothers and sisters that have been affected from devastation of bushfires, floods, obviously earthquakes, the loss of our biodiversity, many things that are very important to us, but also provide a real reality check of, are we moving fast enough? Are we making those changes as we move through these testing times? So there's no more than ever before, it's critical we embed the rich wisdom of our First Nations into every step we take towards a healthier planet. Our profound understanding to care for land, for seas and country, not only lights the way forward, but also takes a tangible form in ventures like the Indigenous Ranger programs of conservation that is steered by First Nations people on the lands, which is their customary lands, their traditional links to those lands. It's not only just that one program, there's many, but this is a technique which has been used for tens of thousands of years, and finally we're starting to see the acknowledgement of the value and the expertise that our First Nations people can bring to address the threat of fires and also the greenhouse emissions. So in our fight against climate change, the vast experiences and knowledges that First Nations people bring in is indispensable in confronting the multifaceted challenges of climate change. So our voice, our strength and our wisdom are not just assets, they are the lifeline of our planet. This dialogue exchange at COP28 is a very powerful moment. It's not just a conversation. I know a lot of people think this is a big talk fest from home, but it's far more than that. This is a combination of our histories, our wisdoms and our hope for the future, where every voice, especially those that have been silenced or marginalised for far too long, is heard, cherished and acted upon. So I'm deeply privileged and humbled to be a part of this panel session today, and I can't wait to hear our distinguished speakers who will bring and highlight not only the impacts of climate, but what is happening in their communities and in their nations of addressing it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin, for those introductory remarks. We're going to bring our additional 3 panellists up right now, and for those at the back, that means we have close to an entire front row of spare seats that you're more than welcome to come up and sit in. So first of all, I'll invite, increasingly I like to now call you my friend. We see each other at many of these events and I've really enjoyed getting to know you. But Tagaloa Cooper-Hallo, who is the Director of the Climate Resilience Program at SPREP, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. Come on up, Tagaloa. And I should mention as well, originally from Niue. Next speaker, if I could invite up Sam Murray, who is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Indigenous Desert Alliance in Australia. And our final speaker, all the way from Canada, Dr. Graham Reid, who's the Strategic Advisor of the Assembly of First Nations. And I apologise, Graham, I didn't check pronunciation first, so I'll get you to say the next word.
Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe. Yeah. Was that close enough? From the Great Lakes in Canada. So, colleagues, if you would like a seat and you don't have one, please feel free to grab some of the remaining seats at the front. So what we've asked each of our panellists to do was bring something, an artefact or a picture or something that they wanted to talk about to kick things off, which helped them to communicate their story and their message as part of this discussion. So, Kagaloa, can we start with you, please?
First of all, whaalofa atu ki atu tōluosi. Whaalofa ki a koe Ambassador Tilly, pia fuki ni mo toka pisinga na kua whalataha uloa ki hao nei. O e tūlogi ki langi ha koe hana whaalofa noa. I bring you greetings from the Pacific. I know we're just next door and we're related, but I thank you, Ambassador, for this opportunity. And I've brought with me these shells. These shell necklaces are used they're ceremonial. They also are used to adorn our young people when they dance. It is a real sense of identity, but it is also the home of small, tiny snails that are found on the coastline in my country that is often quite hard to get to. But the impacts of climate change have meant that they are harder to come by. But they are symbolic of Niuean people. When you see someone in the Pacific with these, they are probably from Niue. And it's a real sense of pride for us as well, and we call it the kahoa hihi. It is gifted in ceremonies, 21sts, weddings. For those who speak, it is worn as part of your armor when you speak publicly, but by and large, it identifies Niuean people, and it's a real source of pride for us. It was such a privilege to speak to you all, and I don't know if I should stop there about this and you ask everyone else.
Maybe we'll keep going and
Thank
come
you.
back with plenty of time.
There's plenty of things to say.
Thanks, Tagaloa. Over to you, Sam.
Yoabalia, Naigo Yini, Sam, Naigo Ngora, Yilka Country. Hello everyone, my name is Sam Murray. I come from Yilka Country in Cosmo Newbury, that's in the middle of WA. And sorry brother, Western Australia is far better than Queensland. I didn't bring anything. I got a photo, which is really important. This is a photo of last year's conference. We have a Indigenous Desert Alliance conference every 2 years where we invite desert ranger teams. So our organisation supports desert rangers in Australia, which is 1/3 of our continent, and we've got a lot of country to look after. But every time we have the conference, we bring rangers together, they come together, they travel for days, thousands of kilometres, because for us, mob coming together is important culturally. As desert people, we've got to support each other to look after country. And in this photo is 400 people that we limited at because of the venue, and 300 of this is desert rangers that are currently looking after 1/3 of Australia.
Thank you, Sam. Graham.
Yeah, Anin Bojo, Graham Reid, Indigenous Cause, Aronojiba, Anishinaabe, and Dao. It's a real honor to join this space with all of you, all the way from central Canada. I grew up in Ottawa. My dad's side is English and Scottish, and my mom's is German and Anishinaabe from a place called Wakumakong. And I'm very grateful to share this conversation with First Nations across the world. What I brought was a strategy that our organization has been working on. The Assembly of First Nations is the organization that I work for. It's a representative body for 634 First Nations across the country. And for the last 4 years or so, we've been working on a national climate strategy. And I bring this to talk about this largely because I think it's very clear what our contributions are to climate, and I think it's very clear what our solutions are to climate. What's different now is the prospect of other people listening to us. And so I'm excited to share this space with all of my relatives here to talk about what that means in practice and what does it mean to center land in our conversations on climate. And so maybe I'll stop there, but really say Chimigwech for this opportunity and look forward to getting into the discussion with all of you.
Thanks, Graham. You've covered yours, Justin. Maybe we'll let you hold on to the microphone. Graham, you mentioned now is the time that people are listening, which is great. We'd love to drive it forward more and say now is the time that people are learning, valuing, embedding, all of those things. So I guess sort of the question we'll pose to all of you, which is relevant here at COP, but relevant in your own nations as well, or I should say your own home countries. How can First Nations peoples and governments work better together to respond to the climate crisis?
Great. This is something I think about a lot. And I think it really starts from how we consider and think about the origins of the crisis that we're facing. And so for First Nations and the way in which we articulate it back home, climate change is really a lens through which we're looking at root causes, and those root causes are largely a result of an imbalanced relationship with the world around us. And so when we think about, how do we respectfully engage with these knowledge systems, we first need to start from the point that there's one knowledge system that is contributing to the ongoing extraction of our ideas, of our land, and of our practices. And ultimately what we're trying to do is to try to think about how do we take a step back and realize that the practices and the values and the behaviors that humans are committing and conducting themselves are actually part of the problem. And so really the release of greenhouse gases, the required need to reduce our emissions and to adapt really stem from a recognition that the problem is different from what First Nations people think. And for First Nations, really we think about those root causes, and we think about how are we disrespecting our spiritual relationship with the land, the lands, the water, the seas, and what are the ways in which that we need to reclaim those relationships with our relatives. The way in which we frame it in our strategy is something that we call the First Nations climate lens. And what we're trying to do within that climate lens is really bring those original relationships and instructions that we have from the Creator and use that as the guiding foundation for what is required for action. And I think that's important within spaces like this that are led by parties, led by governments, led by businesses, largely because the place in which they're starting is not the same. So when we think about how do we ethically and equitably engage with Indigenous peoples, within parties, we really need to start from that standing point of what is the problem we're aspiring to solve, and how do we create space for diverse understandings of what that problem actually is. Because when we take that step back, the solutions are therefore different. We have examples here about rangers. Back in Canada, we have examples about guardians. And really, a lot of the central tenets of practices like that is reestablishing that relationship with the land, which is different from advancing net zero emissions targets or advancing net emission or zero emission vehicles, ZES. And so, we start with those solutions that are different. And so, what we've been trying to do through the strategy and through the work that we're saying is that we have a legitimate parallel proposal for what is required, and ultimately we need to sit at the table together and contemplate how do we understand that starting point, and then how do we, from that point, start with solutions. And I'll stop there. Chimigwech.
Thanks, Graham. Sam?
I think it's, I always talk about seat at the table, so saying thank you to Brother Justin for, allowing me on the panel as being the only Central Desert First Nation here representing from Australia. It's really important that Central Desert voices are heard. Remote Aboriginal communities are the most impacted in Australia, and we're also the least prepared and the least consulted on policies and issues and the important things. So For me, it's about having a seat at the table for desert people, and I think it's important to make sure not only do we have a seat at the table, that we're listened to and respected. Desert rangers and communities are living and working in environments that is changing rapidly. So it's important about seat at the table and then letting Desert Mob be in the room and share their perspectives, because for us it's not something that's coming, it's something that we've already been experiencing 20 years earlier than the rest of Australia.
Oh, thank you, Sam. Tagaloa.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, you asked the question around how we can work better with governments, and I think it's a bit different in different countries. In the Pacific, in my country at least, everybody is impacted by climate change. We all know this, but everybody knows everybody as well. And so everybody take seriously the notion that everybody has a role to play. And for example, the leader of my country, he's a farmer, as well as a leader, as well as a sportsman. And so then you have all of these levels in the community that are all interconnected. And so in all of the spaces they occupy, outside of government, they're all the same people. And so I think that's, and the common denominator in most Pacific countries are our elders and our young people. So there may be a very difference of opinion in the middle of those who are in government and public sector and private sector who are actively engaged, but we do find that children and the elderly are the bridge. And an example of how this has worked to bring traditional knowledge to the front, in my country at least, and the investor in making that work happen has been the Government of Australia. I know, right? So, the COSPAC project funded activities to document traditional knowledge and indicators, so weather indicators. Because Niue is so small, it's the Girls Brigade who went out, worked with the Met Services to document this. They learn the traditional knowledge from their elders. So I guess the byproduct of actually collecting that information is that it's being passed on without people thinking twice about it. And I think that's the beauty of small communities. And so it's very hard for governments to not listen when they are actively engaged and really passionate about that work. And so through this project, COSPAC, what it has been able to do, not just in my country, but across Pacific countries, is it has validated what we've known all along. Our traditional knowledge is what we practice on a daily basis. We know that when there is a certain flower, that there's a drought coming. So our people know when to plant more resilient crops, like yam, that are going to last the drought. And so when you align that to the science of this investment in this project, there's a scientific explanation for it. But what it does is it empowers our people. It empowers our people so that we can come into these spaces and talk about it. So the science is telling us now what we've known all along, and I'm sure for you as well. And and I'm going to give it back, but can I just say that, for each Indigenous person here, and for you, our non-Indigenous people, brothers and sisters here, for us to be in this room together is our ancestors' wildest dreams. And to be here, all the way across the world, to tell our stories. And you have to keep telling your stories, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Thank you.
You hold on to it. Thank you, Tagaloa, and you please don't apologise for spending time on the microphone. This is what this whole event today, and indeed every day, should be about. Justin.
First, before I start, I just have to say Sam's thanking me for her being on the panel. If anyone meets Sam for about 2 minutes, she needs to be on the panel, right? So I'm just going to put that. You deserve to be all by yourself. I think the question you posed to the panel, the order which it was said is exactly what we've got to do. How can governments work better with Indigenous communities? I used to say in my previous role in justice, every past legislation, policy, laws, institutions weren't ever built in the best interest for Aboriginal people or First Nations people. In most cases built to do the complete opposite. So we are needing, as government, as a representative of government, is how we can change to have those conversations, to have our First Nations people around the table, and to move ourselves outside of our comfort zones, outside of our buildings and Parliament houses, and going on country to understand that. And I was in the Canadian presentation yesterday afternoon. The Minister for their Environment, the Canadian Minister for Environment, and the Inuits talked about their relationship. And the Minister went out on country for 2 weeks or something in a boat, put himself in a pretty vulnerable sort of a space, but they built a very strong relationship to be able to then do the business that it needs to be done. And they actually saw the impacts and what Indigenous people were talking to, the Inuits were talking about. He could actually feel it and see it. And I think that's the same as that's a challenge that we've got as governments, of how do we dismantle what our processes are to better embrace the ways of Indigenous people and how they want to do business, and also how they want to communicate. And I think if we get through that, the knowledge transfer and the pace that we can walk with or run with will increase at an immeasurable level.
Wonderful. A set of great suggestions already. I'm going to throw it open to the audience now, because I do want to have plenty of time, should there be enough questions, for you to direct the conversation. If not, I do have some other questions I can go with. But why don't we, hands up if you do have a question. Thanks. And Phil will come over with the microphone. Preference for questions, but we will take statements or perspectives as well.
Hi, Emma Coath from Rocket Cedar. I'm also on the board of the Impact Club, which is based in Australia, nationwide network of, I guess, impact investors, if you like. So we're in the Australian Pavilion, so we're talking about government here and First Nations, but I'd also like to know how the private sector, so private individuals and organisations, can support you as well, because I think there's a lot of really good intent and people really want to support what you're doing, and they're educating themselves, and I think it's really good timing for you to reach out to them, and we can support each other. So does anyone have any view on that?
I think in terms for my mob, it's about understanding that what Justin said, pace, really listening. Sometimes I always talk about code switching, about sometimes we have a different way of doing things than how outside of the desert communities, and if you want to come and support desert communities and desert rangers to look after country, you have to code switch and be prepared to be challenged and go at our pace, look at our cultural indicators for what we want for projects, going at a pace of how you build a relationship. So for me, it's being prepared to be challenged, understanding patience, understanding that if you really genuinely want to support and value Indigenous Australian people, it's going at our pace, what we want, our way. And that could be at complete odds to probably what your organisation or you as an individual might have grown up and seeing that perspective. So, and that's quite hard for some people to change that perspective, but that's the only way you're going to genuinely support Indigenous peoples around the world, not just Australia.
Thanks, Sam. Others?
Yeah, Miigwech, for that question. I'll respond just a little bit differently, largely because one thing that I think is important to understand when contemplating the impacts of climate change is to understand that they're cumulative. and so that they're embedded in a longer-term relationship that First Nations and the state has. And so, for instance, in a Canadian context, our ability to adapt and mitigate to climate change is also related to our ability to make sure that we're not facing chronic infrastructure gaps. And so the way in which our system and our history has been created has created a significant gap between First Nations folks and broader Canadians. And the result of that is, when we contemplate climate, we need to think about both of those things. We need to think about climate solutions as housing solutions. For instance, on reserve in Canada, there's a shortage of around 60,000 units. And those units that are existing are also facing challenges. And so when we contemplate solutions like energy efficiency, when we contemplate solutions that are largely demand-driven or supply-driven, we also need to understand that it's embedded within that longer-term system, and that, you know, we may be talking about different things and asking about different things, but that they're connected to one another. And we need our partners to stand beside or behind us to advance solutions within that context. And I just close by saying, you know, our people have solutions. Those solutions aren't always framed in the way in which, you know, funding envelopes are framed. They're not always framed in the way of, you know, the shiny, beautiful, nature-based solutions way, but they are framed in how are we rebuilding those relationships to land, to country? How are we rebuilding those relationships to each other? And how do we then line our partners up to support us in exercise and developing solutions on our terms, and not on other terms, not integrating into other people's systems, but valuing our systems as equally valid and credible and legitimate in themselves. So, miigwech.
And just sorry to add and share commonalities, my community runs a power card system. A lot of remote communities do in Australia. Every time I go back home, I have to buy a power card to stay in my community. We have to pay far more money for electricity than the rest of Australia, and that's a lot of communities across Australia. So conversations like energy efficiency, and you've got mob who are the most impacted, paying the most electricity, there's those conversations, these discussions tend to open.
I think that's really awesome insight, and I'm happy to be here and to hear those experiences, and I wish more of our Pacific people were in this room right now. In terms of the Pacific, I think we're quite, even the Pacific itself is not the same. We've got 3 sub-regions. We have Micronesia, the northern countries, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, etc., Marshall Islands, and we have Melanesia, which is very close to Australia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji. And then you have down south countries like our country, Niue, Cook Islands, so on, Samoa. And even within those different sub-regions, how we operate cannot be viewed as a common structure across all of the Pacific. So how the private sector can engage is quite different from one country to another country. But in most Pacific countries, we have a Chamber of Commerce that yours is probably a much bigger operation, but it is it is where the private sector has its voice. And we find that in the Pacific, the countries that have utilized the relationship with the private sector are the countries that bounce back faster. So, for example, in some of our countries, they sit on the response committees for natural disasters, etc. And because they don't have the same bureaucracy as government, they are able to, and you're nodding because you know this, and then they are able to respond faster. While government is still, and government, some of the governments in those countries allow that process to happen because it fosters that relationship with them. At the end of the day, though, I think where it works well in the Pacific is where the relationship between the representatives of private sector and government is based on trust. And when I say trust, it's on a common purpose. And the common purpose is to build resilience for our people in our own countries. So I think the Pacific also has developed a framework for resilient development, recognizing that, not only private sector and government is important, but also academia and all of our partners in the Pacific, like the UN agencies, non-traditional partners as well. And so this framework, the idea of it is to bring everybody to the table for adaptation mitigation, as well as just building resilience across the sectors. One important way of bringing the private sector to the table is we in the organisation, in SPREP, we run projections. So we choose different sectors. So for example, there will be the tourism sector or the fisheries sector, and we have what we call the NCOF, the National Climate Outlook. And what that does is it brings that community to the table, tells them these are your projections, and then it allows them to plan for it. And across all of those different sectors, private sector is involved. And so that's a way of bridging, getting everybody to the bridge, as it were, and a common place. And that common purpose is just being more resilient. Thank you.
Did you? Justin?
Yeah, I think the short answer is the private sector has a very important role to play. And as I think mentioned by the panellists, the private sector can do things that government can't do. They can move things sometimes a lot quicker. However, I think the important message for the private sector is that the bottom line or the profit margins or finance isn't what drives Indigenous communities. That's one part, but our cultural connections, our family connections, our responsibilities to land and to community are far more important than a funder which may come through, or maybe an opportunity to have some form of resources in there. And the reason being, I'll use this little example. When I was CEO of Reconciliation Australia, and a major mining company flew their CEO into a remote community because the CEO wanted to meet the community and do and provide support or look at ways that their private business could be more connected with the community they were going to be working in. So the CEO flew in from overseas, drives out in the four-wheel drive, sits there. The meeting was supposed to be at 2 o'clock, and this is him saying this. 2 o'clock comes, no one's around, it's just by himself. Half an hour goes by, he's getting more angrier. How do these people disrespect me? I'm here, I'm waiting, I've used up all this time and money to be here. I could be doing other things. An hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, he's still sitting there by himself. By the third hour, he started to realise that, hang on, my importance and what's important to the community is there's a big difference here. And they had some sorry business to deal with. They got to him when they needed to, but he took a very valuable lesson that his timeframes are so much different to the communities that he's working with. I use that example because a lot of the times it's about time, it's about targets, it's about how we report this back, it's about branding. These things are sometimes often not the important measures of what community wants, and getting that balance. And I think we said earlier today, the relationship part is the part which the investment should be put into, to understand why you're in the community and also who they are wanting to, allow to be able to come into that community, which doesn't line up with a lot of shareholders and reports and annual reports, etc. And I think that balance needs to be, embraced more so than seen that as a difficulty.
Thank you. Great question and some really excellent answers there. So I'm hoping there's at least one or two more questions. We've got right up the back, thanks, Phil. And then afterwards, gentleman in the black shirt.
Thank you all. It's been really great hearing from you. My name is Georgia. I'm from Gundungurra country in New South Wales. I'm from Plan, Australia. So we know that young women and young First Nations women are most impacted by the climate crisis. And as we've seen throughout the COP, there's probably not enough Pacific and Australian First Nations young women here. And I would like to ask the panel, how do we amplify the voices of youth activists that are young First Nations women across Australia and the Pacific, how do we get them into these spaces? What can communities do? What can government do to get them in here? Because I think it's really important that they be involved in the conversations and solutions. Thank you.
Thanks. Why don't we start with the females on the panel?
What a fantastic question, because you fellas are the future leaders for us, or young leaders now. So thank you for asking that question. I reflect upon probably my journey, having a lot of great mentors in my life, to make me feel comfortable, not shame, to talk at venues like this. Is the first time I'm ever doing a panel like this in my life. So having great mentors and also supporting those mentors to support those young women. I reflect upon community. I'm from a remote community. Very lucky to have a lot of wonderful mentors that invest in my journey, and you've got to look after the mentors as well. So there's a lot of young mobs, especially a lot of young powerful women out in the desert, through probably maybe lack of logistics or capacity, want to be here, want to yarn up and talk. So investing in the development and mentoring and doing it steady way at the pace of how they feel comfortable, because young mob will always have lots to say. It's just we've got to help them to get up there brave enough to say it and give them the opportunity to then speak their voice, because as you know, being young and very passionate, you're never short of saying anything. It's just opportunity and that extra someone believing you that you can do it.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I only can speak for the Pacific, not for the Pacific, but from my experience with working in the Pacific. I think there's a very important point here to make. You can bring many of us here, but the value that we bring is by being an official on the delegation. So there's so much work to be done in the negotiations. There's a lot of work that's happening in the green zone, but it really is only impactful when our young women are accredited to countries. I can share that we actively work with our countries. We prepare throughout the year 8 and then a pre-comp workshops to engage virtually, to engage everybody, as many people as we can. And for us, Pacific people, we see that we all have a right to be at the table. Whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter. But it is giving that confidence, growing that confidence in our young people. And it's the same can be said for our young males as well as our young females, depending on which country you're from and the cultural makeup of that country. But we try and empower young people to join the training for young people, join the WIDO training for young women, so that they can get onto delegations as well. At the same time, we run training for our young people through the work that we do through SPRIP as well. So there's one thing, I think, to get a lot more of us here, but the value is in the engagement. The value, in my view, is engaging here, sharing our stories, sharing our experiences, but also in the negotiating rooms, in the contact groups, and down to the wire. And you will find that it grows a relationship of trust when our government officials see our young people in those rooms, and it just means that they, garner more support to carry on. Thank you.
Graham?
Yeah, I also don't think men should shy away from this question as well. Like, I think there's a lot of complicity in men creating unsafe spaces for young women. And so I think that it's really important also for men and Indigenous men to ensure that we are creating those safe spaces for our women. And we have a lot of strong Indigenous women here, at least from my region. Jordan's taken a video from the back. We have Taylor, Marie Philippe, we have Kate, all of who are very strong women. that are here in these spaces. I also don't want to separate that from what we saw 5 days ago or so at the World Leaders Summit, where, what was it, 75% of world leaders are men. And I think that's a problem. And I think that these systems that are creating these problems that we're in are related to one another, whether that's toxic masculinity, whether that's the patriarchy, whether that's colonization, whether that's capitalism, are related, and that we need to be able to identify that, and we need to be able to engage with what that means for how are we appropriately creating these spaces to have those perspectives at the table, to have those representatives making those decisions, and to ensure that, just like we talked about in the context of our private sector, that our men are standing beside and behind our women. And that's that part of reconnecting to land and to our responsibilities that's so important within these spaces. We have a lot of stuff to unlearn. We have a lot of stuff that's been imposed on us. And how are we creating these spaces so that we can do that? We can do that unlearning, and that we can reconnect to, our teachings, our cultures, and our ceremonies that enable us to unpack the negative elements of these systems. So, miigwech.
Well, I think you got my wife's cheering in the background. And I totally agree. I mean, as men, we can't be just turning away from this conversation. But I've got 4 daughters, and my wife's in the audience, so whatever I say is going to definitely get back. I've got to be careful. But what everyone said here is 100% correct. I've just got two things. One is the Australian government has made a very strong focus. But have we got it right? Is the balance right? Is the pathways right? We've still got some journeys to go. I think one is that the capacity, what we build, I mean, having just representatives, and as a First Nation person, talking to just having representation is one thing, but having people that are representing with the knowledge and the backing and the support and knowing how to manoeuvre through this maze that we have is very important, because you want it to be powerful and you want it to be pointed. So one is that we provide the opportunity to build that within our young women. And the other one is, which is more my age and men, is that there's time for us then to move aside and step to allow for the space. And a First Nations woman from the US said this to me. You come in and it's new and everyone's very excited because the numbers are there. But if you're going to have real impact, you got that system, someone's got to move out. Someone's got to leave that space for someone else to come in with that different perspective and to be able to have their voice, not just to be another number in the room, but be an important contributor around the table. So,
just wanted to add to that a little bit of a reflection. I'm currently on a CEO transition, and the CEO currently is a non-Indigenous middle-aged man who wanted to create an organisation that a desert person would end up leading, and it ended up being me, a single mum from a remote community. And that thought process about respect and having those men that will make the space and eventually move out of the way so that people like me can step into the room. Those mentors that I spoke about earlier, that's women and men, that's non-Indigenous and Indigenous people that, and the men in my life that have made the space, my dads and my uncles and my colleagues and my friends. You need that investment and support by the men in the room to make the space for us women as well. We will always fight for it. We're very strong, passionate and stubborn women, but the standing alongside, I love that, because that's 100% what needs to happen, and someone needs to move out of the way to make that space. And from my personal reflection, that is something I'm stepping into a role that's being left by a non-Indigenous man.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Another set of great answers. Justin, thank you for mentioning your wife, Janine, who is, of course, for those who don't know her, a female First Nations leader in her own right. But can I ask that next time you introduce her, you don't do it as your wife, but you introduce yourself as Janine's husband? I think that would be much better. Thank you. All right. I think we have time for one more question, and this gentleman in the audience. Thanks, Phil.
Hey everyone, this is absolutely enriching and heartwarming. I'm really grateful to be here. My name's Trent. I'm from Wurundjeri country. Over the last year, we've actually had the privilege of working with the Eastern Gugu Yulanji traditional owners up in the Daintree. And speaking with one of the elders, Richard Birchall, he's shared something that's really stuck with me, which is we need to look back in order to move forward. And here we are at COP, and as we look around us, we're looking at a lot of innovation and future-focused thinking and digital solutions as a way to address the climate crisis. And so this sort of long-termism approach doesn't necessarily feel like the right way, especially with Richard's message in mind. And so I was wondering what advice you might give to us in the room to think about how we can help elevate traditional ecological knowledge and amplify really the First Nations wisdom around us from all around the world in order to take something from today and put it into action.
Wonderful. I think we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so a good minute each, I think, in response.
I'm going to go first. Thank you. That's a really good question. The Pacific being here, our purpose is twofold. Our supporters as an organisation, we serve 21 countries and territories in the Pacific, and our purpose is to empower our people and amplify their voice. So a lot of the work that goes into amplifying our voice is a lot of preparation before we get here, and it will continue after this. We have 80 events in there. Every single one of them will involve Pacific Island stories and Pacific Island countries. And then we have digital campaigns that carry on as well. I think the value in how we carry this forward is in how we as individuals find purpose in this and in telling the story. There will be spaces where people don't want to hear the Indigenous story. There will be spaces where people tell us there is no place for those conversations or those interactions. But from a Pacific perspective, I was raised by strong women. So when people say to me, how does it feel to be leading this work? I just think, well, am I supposed to feel anything different? Because I'm where I'm supposed to be. And that's my view, that is my calling. And I think if everybody in this room leaves this room today and sees what the question you're asking about the how as our calling, as individuals, then as a collective, who's going to stop us? We have to make those spaces, we have to have those conversations. And I know sometimes it's difficult because some people don't see it the same way. Some people don't see an audience like this, a panel like us is legitimate, or that we don't have a place. But can I just end by saying this? We didn't just get here. We navigated for generations our way to get here. And so if we can get here as Indigenous people representing Indigenous communities and our knowledge base, then we're going to take it a lot further. We just need the advocacy and the boldness and bravery of people who occupy those spaces to allow us to do that. Whaftain.
Sam, I'm going to pause and thank you, Tagalara. Hand to the male members of the panel, largely because I cannot believe this is the first panel you've been on, because you've been so impressive. I want to give you the last word. Justin.
So with the question, probably just a very short, as Indigenous people, we'll keep advocating and keep pushing, and government, and we've done that for decades and decades, and to even have this sort of gathering here at COP. Just got back from APEC, and there's Indigenous, dialogue starting to take place. But it's really, if my math's right and my information I have, we make up, as Indigenous people of the world, make up about 3%. It's the 97% that has to keep pushing this for us. We saw recently in Australia with our referendum, when the data came out, majority of Indigenous people in Australia wanted to progress to have more of a voice. But the overall population, there was a different result. So it's a 97% that if you've got any non-Indigenous people in this room, you need to keep your peers where you are, keep putting on the table and keep asking that question. And if you have, as Indigenous people, your friends and colleagues, keep holding them to account, because that's the only way we're going to continue to make sure that we have got a voice in these forums, we've got our perspectives put out, and that the structures that are there will take an inward look and see if they are connecting or they are culturally safe for our Indigenous peoples to even to be engaging with.
Graham.
Yeah, miigwech for that question. I'd say two things. My elders would tell me you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And part of this and part of what Justin shared is really about how are we listening not only to hear, but listening actually to listen. And I think we're in an environment where we're talking past one another. And how do we create the space to actually hear one another and hear these solutions that we're advancing? And my second point, just as closing, would be, like, as we think about what the future is going to look like, we need to contemplate how the present was made. And are we indirectly perpetuating that present into the future? And I say that largely because in the Canadian context, we talk about the journey towards decarbonization needs to go in parallel to the journey of decolonization. And we need to advance those things in parallel because we need to avoid reproducing those systems of oppression in whatever that future beautiful state is going to be. And I would encourage folks, as you're contemplating what that future looks like, to really think through, what are the core assumptions that you have in projecting into that future, and how are we wrestling with that critically, internally, about how do we see ourselves within that future. So Chimigwech.
Sam, no pressure. Final word.
I'm just reflecting on what wise thing I can say. Going back to, I suppose I start with the same sentence and end with the same sentence. Like our elders say, and across all our mobs, we know how to look after our country the right way. And I think sometimes, we do that because culturally it's part of our identity and our spirit. It's who we are. But the other benefit that needs to be elevated and supported, endorsed more, is not only we're doing it culturally for the right reason, we're actually doing it the right way environmentally. We are looking after threatened species, we are looking after country, we are burning country the right way. So we're not only hitting cultural outcomes for our mob, we're also hitting environmental outcomes for you mob. So what I say is give us the space, support us, listen to us, because again, we know how to look after our country the right way.
Wonderful. Can I close by sincerely thanking the panel and sincerely thanking the very large audience that's come along. I feel highly embarrassed that we have Indigenous Peoples Day. I mean, every day should be having these conversations in the way that meet Indigenous people on their terms. So let's keep doing it and keep doing a better job. For those of you who want to continue the conversation right now, I think many of our panellists are happy to stick around, have a coffee, have a yarn. And for those that are interested in seeing a little film that was pulled together from some recent conversations and events that have happened in Australia, I think there'll be a video, around a 10-minute video shown here as well. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming along today.